Welcome to the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley, psychology student and international best-selling psychology author of over 30 psychology books, bringing you the latest psychology news, fascinating psychology topics and more each week. If you want to learn more, then please check out connorwhiteley.net/books. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the YouTube video or follow on your favourite podcast app. And here's the show. Hi everyone and welcome to episode 319 of the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley. And today's episode is on how to reduce conflict between parents. And it is Thursday the 19th of April 2025 as I record this. So the reason why today's podcast episode is really important is because if a child is exposed to constant conflict between parents, then this can be very damaging. So this can either be persistent conflict or extreme conflict. And if this happens over a long period of time, then this can have several negative impacts on a child's development. And that's something that I talk about in today's podcast episode. Plus, if you're a UK listener, and if you live in Kent, the same county as me, then you might have heard on the radio. Please note, I'm not an often radio listener, it's just when I don't have a podcast or an audiobook to listen to, I listen to the radio. And Kent County Council has had this advert playing for quite a few weeks now, which is where it focuses on the impact that parental conflict has on children. And most importantly, children hear and feel and see a lot more than parents realise, which I think is a fascinating concept, but also very true though, was that children, they pick up on the emotions, they pick on the subtle signs, they pick up on the tension, the conflict, the hate in a household. So it's really interesting. So by the end of this podcast episode, you're going to understand why is it important to look at parental conflict? How does parental conflict, that's persistent and extreme, damage a child's development? And also, 8 different ways how we can reduce parental conflict. It was a brilliant podcast episode. I really enjoyed it, and I know you're going to get a lot out of this too. So, moving on to the psychology news section, we're reading from the British Psychological Society Research Digest. And the first one's really interesting, because I had a quick sneak peek before I started recording. Precision of a memory can be seen in the eyes. The eyes are windows to your soul, according to Shakespeare. They're also an extremely accurate guide to the precision of a memory, according to a recent study in the Journal of Experimental Psychology, Learning, Memory and Cognition. Psychologists have known for a long time that there are links between pupil size and memory. Previous work has shown that our pupils dilate in response to cognitive load, and also that changes in pupil size are linked not only to memory processing, but also to attention and decision making. This new paper, however, is particularly striking in that it suggests that there's a linear relationship between memory precision and pupil dilation. New knowledge could eventually lead to some interesting real-world applications. Wow! Okay, now that is interesting because I know at some point, I think it's June or something. Well, I know at some point this year, I'm releasing a book called The Forensic Psychology of Deception, and it's a forensic and criminal psychology guide to deceit, lying, and criminal deception. And one of the biggest takeaways from that book is the fact that we don't have many accurate lie detection signs. So it's interesting that if we can monitor and if we can record someone's eye movement and the size of their pupils in a police interrogation, for example, that could be very powerful. That could actually be a decent indicator of lying. Especially if we're getting to tell a lie during a recall test. or a question that really makes them think. So it's definitely interesting. I I've not come across this before, and I definitely think that there needs to be more studies about replication and trying to apply this in the real world to see if this is as groundbreaking as I think this could be, and a bunch of other researchers. But something I would like to mention is I would be interested in knowing about the false positive rates because if we look at what the article said also that changes in pupil size are linked not only to memory processing but to attention and decision making. Now, if you're trying to remember something though, and you're paying a lot of attention to it, and if you're trying to make a few decisions about what to include, then something I would be interested to see is could this lead to a false positive though, so you think that a memory is very precise because of the shrinking of the pupils or the dilation, but in reality you're actually just paying a lot of attention to it. Also, because I've been doing my revision for my neuropsychology of aging exam this week, I would be quite interested in knowing, because older adults, because they have a problem with inhibition, so they're not able to suppress irrelevant information in memories during the encoding and the retrieval process. I would be quite interested in knowing, does this result actually still apply to them? So there's a lot more research that needs to be done to this before this could ever be used in the real world accurately and efficiently. But this is definitely fascinating food for thought. What are your thoughts on it? So the second one is, soldiers in combat can kill without moral injury. Killing another person is not necessarily harmful to a soldier's mental health. In fact, the impact on well-being depends more on the context than the act itself. At least this is the conclusion of a large-scale study of Norwegian soldiers, led by Andres Northstram. By comparing mental health and moral injury in soldiers who were being deployed to combat and peacekeeping missions, the team identifies clear differences between the outcomes of those serving in each context. These findings contradict the commonly held belief that killing is an unnatural act of humans that inevitably inflicts a moral injury on an individual, the researchers write in Armed Forces and Societies. Yeah, and that's something that I find quite interesting in the sense that people think that killing is an unnatural act of humans. But if you think about it, humans, and of course, like, killing is wrong, like, I will take the moral stance on that no one should, kill. But I will also say, though, that humans are predators by nature. And if you look at the arguments, I forget, I forget the researchers. I think it was Thomas Hobbes. I think he was either the guy who said that society is making us more violent, or the other guy who says that society is curbing our natural instinct towards aggression. And all the research shows that aggression is actually being curbed by modern society because we've got stricter social norms that, and we don't need to cause as much conflict over resources, etc. So it's interesting that people believe that killing is a natural act for humans, because humans are predators first and foremost. And if you look back in our history, when we were tribes just fighting to survive against other forms of like Homo sapiens, we would fight, we would kill for resources, whether this was material goods or mates. So I also think that the context is actually quite important though, because normally we don't think about this in terms of everyday life though. But if someone kills in self-defense, so if someone breaks into your house, and they try to kill you, so you kill them, then our first thought isn't that causes moral injury to the person, but that's self-defense. So context is very important when it comes to killing. killing them. So killing is still wrong. Ideally, we live in a world where killing and soldiers are not needed, but unfortunately, that is not the world we live in at the moment. Who knows? We might be able to get there one day in a few centuries, but who knows? So the last one is, how long does it take to get over an ex? If you watch Sex in the City, you might be familiar with the now oft repeated hypothesis that it takes half the time you in the relationship to get over the breakup. Together for 6 months, give it 3, and you'll be able to move on. Luckily, for those who have seen very long term relationships, then rule is unlikely to be true. But how long does it take for our attachment to ex partners to fade? This is the subject of a new research by Jing Yong and R. Chris Fairley. They find that the majority of people do get over their exes given enough time, but a number of factors influence the timeline and extent to which emotional ties persist. And I will read one paragraph from the BPS Research Digest website. Open quote. Around 58% of participants reported moving onto a new relationship since their last significant breakup. The analysis revealed that this didn't help them get over their ex faster. Having children with their ex, however, did speed up detachment. Whilst those who had kids with their ex did have stronger attachment initially, these faded even quicker than those without children, perhaps because of the strains of co-parenting. Close quote. Okay, so that actually ties very nicely into today's podcast episode, because one of the issues with co-parenting is that if one partner isn't pulling their weight, if they're causing conflict, if they aren't doing their end of the bargain, then this is going to make you stress. This is going to make you see a whole lot of flaws, which, to be honest, is just going to put strain on the attachment. And you're basically going to end up and turn around and think, wow, why was I ever attracted to that person? And those sort of findings. So that's definitely quite useful for today's podcast episode. But I remember this one clip from The Big Bang Theory, the comedy show, which is when Sheldon's talking about in literally every single issue of a Cosmo magazine, which I presume is basically a sort of tabloid fancy women's magazine in America. There's literally a list of how to get over an ex in every single issue. So it's definitely a big part of our culture. It's definitely something that a lot of people will think about, because breakups do happen. They do hurt. And it's awful when they happen. And people want to be able to make their suffering, the emotional pain that they're feeling, easier. So it's good that we do have the academic research, because let's face it, some of these pop articles are just useless, and they're very much in the pop domain. So they sound interesting, they've got good headlines and everything, but what's the truth? What is the scientific truth behind how to get over a breakup? That's what I'm interested in. So it's always nice to look at these articles in more depth. So I hope you enjoy the psychology news section. So let's move on to the personal update. So we're moving on to the personal update. I have had an absolutely lovely week, and I'm really happy at the moment. And I'm not 100% sure why, because it's been a very chaotic week in places. But also, it's just been lovely. It's been lovely just having a week to myself. Now, I do not get a lot of time to myself to do my projects. For example, next week I've overbooked myself with my outreach work, because I'm doing a bunch of work at a local college. So I'll be doing some revision sessions with them, and I'll be leading that. I've also got to do reading support up in Medway, and then I'm working at a university open day on the Saturday. So there's a lot of different bits and pieces to do that, which does mean I don't have as much time to do my bits, which is my mistake. and I fully own that, and I admit that. But this week, it's been lovely being able to do my own projects. So I'm doing lots of revision. I've been working on my neuropsychology of aging book, which I'm really looking forward to, because it's one of the best ways how I revise. I take my notes, I do a bunch of extra research, I watch the lectures, and then I turn my notes into books, because by able to write a book about it, and also being able to explain it to you wonderful readers in a way that helps me, that's easy to understand. That really does help me to understand the topic in a lot more depth, and also make sure that I understand the topic. So that's a lot of fun. I'm really confident about this exam now, which is a lot nicer, because I was quite stressed about this. I was not looking forward to this exam, because when I was doing the module, my mental health was really not the best. So I could not take much in at the time. But I'm really glad that I'm able to focus, and I actually do understand a lot more about the topic than I previously thought. So it's a lot of fun. I've also been doing a whole bunch of other bits of like fiction writing, which is a lot of fun. And for the first time ever, I think I'm actually going to be able to complete my weekly to-do list, though, which is really nice though, because I made sure that I was like quite taming it, and there's a lot of really good content coming in the future on the podcast. And then tomorrow I'm actually going back up to Medway to spend Easter with my family. So lots of good things happening at the moment, and I'm really, really happy. Oh, plus there's a book recommendation that I want to give you. If any of you are into gay romance, highly, highly recommend I Want to Kiss You in the Public by Zelda French. It's a brilliant book. Normally I avoid 100,000 word books like The Plague, because they're too big for me, but this book actually had me hooked, because it's such a lovely story, it's really funny, and it's just such a lovely gay romance. So I highly recommend it. And as always, I always love to hear your thoughts and feelings on today's episode. So you can always email me, connorwhiteley@connorwhiteley.net. You can always leave a comment at the show notes at connorwhiteley.net/podcast. And you can always tweet me on Twitter at sci-fi Whiteley. I always love to hear from all of you, because it really helps make the podcast feel more like a conversation. And always, feel free to send pictures of where you're listening in from. I like to see where people are listening from all over the world. And today's podcast episode has been sponsored by Developmental Psychology, a guide to developmental and child psychology. So this is a great sponsor for today's episode, because the whole point of today's episode is, how do we reduce parental conflict just so we don't harm child development? But what other factors actually impact a child's development? So by the end of this great, really easy to understand book that's very popular and sells tons of copies every single month without fail, what you're going to learn is what factors impact brain development, cognitive development, theory of the mind, and also how does play impact our behaviour, and how can children learn through play and peer interactions. But then we also look at attachment theory, autism, a whole bunch of different neurodevelopmental conditions, and lots of different facets that help you to understand what impacts child development. So there's a lot of really good topics that I really enjoy about this book. And I used to say that I didn't like developmental psychology, but in reality I really do, because now as I work with more children through my outreach work, as I do more research in attachment theory and a whole bunch of other bits and pieces, what happens in your childhood really does impact you as an adult. And I can see the different environmental factors of the children that I work with, how it impacts them on a developmental level. So it's really interesting. Developmental psychology, I think, is one of the more applied areas of psychology that you can directly apply to everyday life. So It's fascinating, it's really important to understand, and it's just flat out critical. So I really do understand this is a great, easy to understand book that will help you get a really firm understanding of developmental psychology. So that's Developmental Psychology, a guide to developmental and child psychology, available for all major ebook retailers, and you can order the paperback and the hardback version from Amazon, your local bookstore or local library if you request it. And if you want the audiobook narrated by artificial intelligence, then now you can at selected audiobook platforms like Spotify, Google Play, Kobo, and Barnes & Noble, and selected library systems like Overdrive, Baker & Taylor, and Biblioteca. So whilst buying books helps to support the creation and the editing of the podcast, my time is sponsored by my wonderful patrons. And as always, a massive thank you to my patrons, because your support shows that you like the show and you are wanting to continue. So if you wanted to become a patron of the show and get access to tons of great rewards, now you can. So this includes lots of exclusive blog posts, which won't be made into a podcast episode for months and weeks or even years, to be honest. Plus, you also get early access to the podcast episodes. For example, this podcast episode isn't going to go out for another 2 days, but the patrons of the podcast had access to the blog post about an hour ago. So there are lots of great benefits to becoming a patron. So if you wanted to become a patron, then please head on over to patreon.com/the Psychology World Podcast. Or if you wanted to support the podcast on a one-off basis, now you can at buymeacoffee.com/Conor Whiteley. And that's enough personal update. Let's move on to the content part of today's episode. So we're moving on to the content part of today's episode. So we're going to be talking about how to reduce conflict between parents. This is a great episode, so let's dive into it. Why do we need to talk about conflict between parents? I'll explain in the next section the damaging impact that parental conflict has on a child, but I want to start off this podcast episode by mentioning that it is normal to argue and for there to be conflict in a relationship. There will be things in your life that just annoy you, be it work, home life, or just being a parent. These things can cause you to become stressed and agitated. It's okay. And this can cause a lot of friction in the household, so arguing and shouting happens. Unfortunately, there are times when this happens in front of children. I want to stress that some conflict is normal, because it truly is, and not all conflict is damaging to children. If parents didn't argue at all, then I would be more suspicious of that, as I don't know a single couple, a single group of parents, and a single friendship that doesn't argue at least once. However, there will be times when this parental conflict can increase to unhealthy levels. This could be screaming at each other and shouting without a resolution, communicating to each other in disrespectful ways, or periods of silence. This is not healthy communication at all, and it is this persistent and such an extreme source of conflict that damages child development, not only in terms of their mental health, but it can damage the relationship between the child and the parent too. No parent wants interparental conflict to harm their relationship with their own child, so that's why we need to focus on how to reduce it. How does constant parental conflict harm child development? Also, I should note that there are references and citations available in the podcast episode or the blog post at conorwhiteley.net/podcast. There are a lot of significant ways how constant or persistent parental conflict can harm child development. For example, it can harm a child's emotional and psychological well-being, since persistent exposure to parental conflict can lead to a child becoming emotionally insecure. This can manifest as depression, anxiety, or behavioral difficulties. These harmful effects can become worse because typically children feel caught in the middle of their parents' conflict, so this increases feelings of stress and hopelessness. In addition, the sheer level of the stress and other difficult emotions caused by persistent parental conflict can harm academic performance in children. The associated stress can impair a child's cognitive functioning and concentration, so they can't focus on their lessons, so their academic performance worsens. Another negative outcome of persistent parental conflict is that it harms a child's social development. Since research shows increased parental conflict correlates with reduced prosocial behavior and an increase in problems with same age peers in children, as well as these social difficulties can become worse because of parental behavior. For instance, if a parent doesn't show a child emotional warmth or positive communication, then the child won't know how to show emotional warmth or and positive communication either. This only continues to harm their relationships with other children and people. Finally, for this section, it's important that we realise these harmful effects of parental conflict aren't short term, they only last a few years. These damaging, awful effects can last well into adulthood, and it can and will continue to harm a child's self esteem, social relationships, and their overall mental health. Personally, I know at the end of the day, all of us are only human. We all make mistakes, and there are times when we just want the other person to listen to us for once in their life. We want them to pay attention and hear our side of the story. Sometimes, sometimes it feels like shouting, screaming, and having a real argument is the only way to possibly get through to them. And sometimes when the other parent is talking to us about silly things after a hard day's work, we snap. We are only human. However, I've just listed 4 ways how persistent parental conflict impacts a child's development. I am not a parent, and I can only imagine how hard it is to raise a child, but we need to try to reduce parental conflict as much as possible. There are other ways to sort out conflict, because these conflicts will always happen in relationships. But there are healthy ways to sort out conflict that do not end up damaging your child's development. How to reduce parental conflict. Now we know the damaging impact parental conflict can have on children, let's look at some ways to reduce conflict. Although it is important to remember that whenever it comes to conflict within relationships, you need to keep yourself safe. This means if you ever feel threatened or unsafe by your partner, then this is not okay. No one should ever feel unsafe or threatened by their partner. And if your relationship has become abusive, then please seek support for domestic abuse. You deserve and need to feel safe in your own home. One way to reduce interparental conflict is to avoid using the you word. As I've been researching and learning a lot more about attachment and how to deal with conflict in relationships, this is a persistent piece of advice that I've seen repeatedly. The issue of using you statements in arguments is that these statements make the other person feel targeted and like you're accusing them of something. This leads to the other person to become more defensive, so try and use I statements in instead. For instance, let's say your co-parent is meant to pick up the kids every Tuesday and Friday, because those are the days that you have to work longer for your job. Yet, every Tuesday and Friday, your co-parent never picks up the kids like they're meant to, so you need to rely on a friend at the same school to take your kids to your co-parents. Instead of saying, you never pick up the kids like you're meant to and you annoy me, try saying something along the lines of, I feel annoyed when you don't pick the kids up on Tuesdays and Fridays like we agreed. So you see how that's less accusatory than the you statement version. Thirdly, in relationships, it's important to recognize how you argue. At first, this idea might make no sense at all, but surely everyone just argues and there are no different types. In reality, all couples and parents need to understand how they communicate to each other, and how to communicate arguments and disagreements to each other is an important part of this process, especially if you and your partner both approach arguments with very different styles. For example, you might be very calm, collected, who deals with conflict and arguments in a calm, logical manner, where you focus on solutions instead of negative emotions. Whereas your partner might be the exact opposite. They prefer to shout and scream, and they get even more annoyed when you don't show negative emotions as well. Then this might only make the arguments worse. So it's important to recognize how you both argue and how best to deal with your different approaches. Two final aspects of this recognition part of parental conflict is to make sure you think about what triggers you and your partner. It will definitely take some time to think about and identify some of the issues that might trigger a strong reaction in you or your partner. Most people just go through their entire lives without giving this much thought, and this leads to a lot of negative relationship patterns because the couple aren't able to identify triggers and adapt their behaviour to deal with these triggering topics in a healthy way. Finally, my main audience on the podcast are aspiring and qualified psychologists or people interested in psychology. Active listening skills are a massive part of our profession, and whilst I strongly discourage you from bringing your therapy skills into the home, because no partner wants to feel like a client. Yet listening to your partner or co-parent without interruption is flat out critical for reducing parental conflict, because everyone wants to feel heard. Therefore, even if you have an important point to make or counter what they've said, just allow your partner to finish what they're saying and try to see the conflict from their point of view before responding. How to reduce parental conflict by taking a break, being open to compromise, and choosing the right time. 3 more ways to reduce parental conflict includes: if you can't stay calm during an argument or conflict, then please take a break. I don't think it's possible to avoid conflict with heated emotions forever, even for myself, who never really tends to get angry or show heated emotions. There are times when I do get angry, and I show a lot of heated emotions. When these situations arise, it's normally a good idea to take a break so both people in the conflict can take some time to cool down, so that when you next come back to the conversation, it can hopefully go better. But ultimately, in any sort of a conflict, it's important to choose the right time to address issues, and this is something that I've learned over the past few weeks. It turns out that a major difference between people with anxious attachment and avoidant attachment is that a person with anxious attachment tends to want to resolve conflict immediately, even if this is a bad time for the other person to engage in a conflict. Whereas an avoidant person will avoid discussing and resolving conflict at all. I mention these attachment facts because I recently learned with some conflict in my house that I wanted to resolve conflict immediately, but the moment I picked wasn't a good time for the other person, and this made the conflict worse. Therefore, if you want to talk to your partner or co-parent about an important issue, then it's best if you make sure to give yourself enough time to talk about the issue. Ideally, this discussion will happen somewhere where you won't be interrupted or overheard, so it's a good idea to set aside some time to have a proper conversation when it suits you both. Finally, you can reduce parental conflict by being open to compromise. I know from experience that when we're in an argument with heated emotions, we can just focus on winning an argument and making sure that we are the ones who walk away with the best result. The problem with this approach to argument is that we don't tend to reach a solution with our partner, So this isn't a helpful way of resolving issues. Therefore, it's more helpful to be clear with your co-parent about what you're willing to compromise on and what you won't. Boundaries are critical in all relationships, and this is another boundary exercise. What are you flexible on and what aren't you? Interestingly, once you start thinking about compromise, you'll probably realize some of these areas that you could never originally compromise on are actually less important than you thought. Conclusion. So, life is stressful, and I cannot imagine how hard it is raising a child with the stresses of work, home life, relationships, friendships, and many other factors on top of that. Parenting and life as an adult is not easy. Therefore, it is normal for parents to argue, but sometimes all we just need is a release when our stresses get to unbearable levels. That isn't the problem. The problem is when parental conflict and arguments become often and extreme. This only damages your child's development by harming their physical, emotional, and social development, as well as it harms their academic performance, and parental conflict has long-term effects that ensure the harmful, damaging effects that conflicts inflict on children last long into adulthood. This is why it's critical that parents learn how to reduce conflict by focusing on keeping themselves safe. Understand how both parents argue, avoid using you statements, and use I statements instead. And if parents cannot stay calm, then take a break and choose the right time to address issues and listen without interrupting your partner. As well as it's helpful to know what triggers you and your partner, and most importantly, be open to compromise in conflict. Parental conflict doesn't have to escalate to damaging levels. It is avoidable if parents take a step back, learn how to deal with their emotions and conflicts better, and focus on doing this for the betterment of their child. Reducing conflict does take work and a lot of effort, but if it means in ensuring your child has the best and healthiest start to life, doesn't that make it all worth it? And here are some questions to get you thinking at the end of this podcast episode. How often did your parents argue when you were a kid? How do you argue now? What triggers you and your partner in a relationship? What unhealthy ways of communicating might you and your partner have? How could you and your partner reduce conflict in your relationship? So I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode and you got something out of it. I know that I did because after listening to that radio advert so many times in the car, because sometimes I just cannot be asked to put a podcast episode on, and sometimes I run out of audiobooks. You don't know how painful that is at times. So I just wanted to explore this in a little more depth because I know it's in like important. I know parental conflict is horrible for a child to experience, so I just wanted to try and help raise more awareness, and also like I would like to become a parent in in the future. So this is always useful information to have. So if you know anyone who would enjoy today's episode, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help spread the word about the podcast. And if you want to learn more, please check out Developmental Psychology, available in all of the usual places, and the AI-generated audiobook is available on selected audiobook retailers like Spotify, Kobo, Google Play, and selected library systems. And if you want to support the podcast on a monthly basis, then please head on over to patreon.com/The Psychology World Podcast. Or if you want to support the podcast on a one-off basis, then please head on over to buymeacoffee.com/The Psychology World Podcast. So, have a great day, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Found it helpful. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel, and follow the podcast on your favourite podcast app. And if you wanted to learn more, then please check out the backlist of the podcast episodes or my books at conwiley.net. So have a great day, and I'll see you next time.